Hello, my name is Giauna, and I am a jazz studies TA at the University of Iowa. And today, I would like to talk to you guys about a little bit of jazz history. Jazz started in New Orleans. It was a collective of African Americans and Europeans, and it came together with a fusion of the harmonies and instruments of Europe, but the rhythm and the movement of Africans. I play drum set, so what I'm going to talk about is the role the drum set played in early jazz history. In early jazz, drums played more of a role of simple timekeeping as well as small rhythmic ideas behind soloists while they played it in the bands. Bands at this time were very small and comprised of small instruments. Majority of this early style was a combination of Creole, which is a specific of Europeans, Spanish, African, and a lot of those rhythms can be heard in the drum set. Some early characteristics of New Orleans style playing in jazz simply comprise of a lot of bass drum and snare drum, because at the time these were instruments that were left over from the war. So a drummer that I can reference is Baby Dodds, who was one of the first great jazz drummers who set a lot of patterns in place for what jazz drumming is today. I will demonstrate a few things.
Hi everybody, I'm Jacob, and I play the bass. I'm also a University of Iowa student, just like Giauna. So you heard from Giauna that in early jazz it came from New Orleans. Well, after early jazz, we see jazz move up into Chicago, and then eventually to both New York and to the West Coast. As jazz went both to New York and to the West Coast, we also see the instrumentation that we had in New Orleans change. We start seeing the three-horn arrangement of the clarinet, the trumpet, and the trombone in the front actually develop into the big band. So we start seeing people like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, both really prominent Black Americans and artists. So in early New Orleans music, the bass's role was really to play in two, which composed of two half notes like this. But as we move into the swing era, really the vibrancy of jazz is really about the dance. And so we start seeing the four on the floor in the bass drum, which you heard from Giauna in her example, and the bass mimics that in its walking bass line, like this. Important things, both in the swing era and in the traditional jazz from New Orleans, and continuing on throughout the rest of the jazz that you'll hear about later in this video, is the fact that jazz is centered around improvisation, which is creating the music as it comes. So the chords that are being played by the bass, you'll hear the piano, as well as the drum set. As the rhythm section plays the changes, the horn players have the freedom to improvise or create their own melodies and their own song over top of the changes that we're creating. And we're creating it also in an improvisatory fashion. So soloing something like you'll hear the melody of the tune, and then maybe the saxophone player will take a solo. Then when they're done, the trumpet player would take a solo, or the pianist would take a solo, and then oftentimes the bass player may take a solo last. And then we'll do something called trading fours, which is where a horn player would play a section of the bar, and then the drum would play that same amount of sections, and then it would go to the pianist and then the drummer. So it's basically trading solos with the drummer. And so this aspect of creating the music is really the center point of what makes jazz so great.
Hi everybody, my name is Cole. I'm a jazz studies student here, and I play the saxophone. So picking up where Jacob left in the swing era, these bands were filled with 5 saxophones, 3 to 5 trombones, 3 to 5 trumpets, and a full rhythm section. And these big bands were quite popular and playing all across the country. Now, something that you might expect to hear from an alto saxophone in big band era, like someone like Johnny Hodges, might sound like this. Very lyrical and melodic. But in the years following that, in New York especially, people such as Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk really started to branch out into different types of playing. These different geniuses really stretched the boundaries of what was accepted in the music. So now something that Charlie Parker might play would be like this.
Hi, my name is Jon Eldridge II. I am, like the people you just heard from, a TA here at the University of Iowa. My instrument is piano. It has been for 19 years now. And so we'll talk a little bit about what happened in the later years of jazz. So coming into the last half of the 20th century, a lot of jazz musicians started to move away from the sound that had been traditional or expected up to that point. And so what happened was you had a lot of new styles emerge out of that. Believe it or not, most of the styles of music that we enjoy today, like funk and R&B, hip hop, rock and roll, most of these styles emerged directly out of jazz in some way. But because jazz was waning in popularity in the last half of the 20th century, a lot of jazz musicians felt like they needed to adopt some of the things that were being done in other genres and bring them into jazz. So before then, what you might have heard in bebop would sound something like this. Now, once we start to get into the post-bop eras, pianists especially, like, for example, Keith Jarrett or Herbie Hancock or the late Chick Corea, would expand their playing possibilities greatly and started to experiment with all the different colors and sounds of the piano. So what you might hear in post-bop would sound something a little more like this.
So picking up where Jonathan left off in the post-bop era with people like Keith Jarrett, Herbie Hancock, and the late Chick Corea, we head into the 90s where people like Wynton Marsalis founded a movement that people might consider neoclassical, which is coming back into the tradition. So these people looked back into the roots of swing music and bebop, and especially the black roots of the music, and really embraced where it came from. Into the 21st century, we had people such as Joshua Redman, who kind of combined soul, bebop, and R&B, and had a fun mix of music that came out. And now into contemporary times, we have a lot of great musicians, young musicians, such as Marquise Hill, a trumpet player, Braxton Cook, an alto player, Emmanuel Wilkins, another alto player, and John Batiste is a piano player. And so the music is still alive today very much, and these people continue to push the music forward and find new creative ways to explore it.
Now we are going to play a tune from the Swinger titled Take the A Train, composed and written by Billy Strayhorn. Now we are all in a jazz combo setting, and pay attention to how all the instruments interact.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So this tune is called St. Thomas. It was written by the great tenor saxophonist Sonny Rollins. It was named after one of the U.S. Virgin Islands called St. Thomas, which is where my mother just so happens to be from.
On behalf of everyone here at the University of Iowa Jazz Program, thanks for watching.